Hello, everybody. We're back. Today we got something a little off the beaten path. Typically, I'd be reading Rialto the Marvelous today, but I might go ahead and push that out to Wednesday or next Monday because instead I've recently been enjoying some Clark Ashton Smith, prompted, in fact, by an album by, I believe they're a French band named Aracanist, kind of a Berlin school style dungeon synth band. They have this absolutely killer album named Poseidonis, or I can't, I'm terrible at pronouncing half of the places C.A. Smith comes up with, but Poseidonis, you get the idea. Anyway, the album is based off of The Last Incantation as well as The Death of Malygris by C.A. Smith. They're both excellent short stories. Clark Ashton Smith is very rich in his writing and his descriptions of eldritch adjuncts and artifacts and heavy dark magics. It's almost oppressive atmosphere. And the album just is exquisite for the two stories. So I got in touch with, the label, the Yuggoth label, the Yuggoth Records. And Peter, the guy who runs the label, said that he and the band are totally interested in letting me read those C.A. Smith stories to the album. So that's what we're going to do today. So for The Last Incantation, I'm going to play the eponymous song on the album on repeat for that story. And then for The Death of Malygris, I'll play the whole album through as I read. But we'll get started in about a minute and a half, while I just get everything set up and perhaps people join. We'll see. So I'll be with you all shortly. Okay, let's begin. This is The Last Incantation by Clark Ashton Smith. Malygris, the magician, sat in the topmost room of his tower that was builded on a conical hill above the heart of Susren, capital of Poseidonis. Wrought of a dark stone mined from deep in the earth, perdurable and hard as the fabled adamant, this tower loomed above all others and flung its shadow far on the roofs and domes of the city, even as the sinister power of Malygris had thrown its darkness on the minds of men. Now, Malygris was old, and all the baleful might of his enchantments, all the dreadful or curious demons under his control, all the fear that he had wrought in the hearts of kings and prelates were no longer enough to assuage the black ennui of his days. In his chair that was fashioned from the ivory of mastodons, inset with terrible cryptic runes of red tourmalines and azure crystals, he stared moodily through the one lozenge-shaped window of fulvous glass. His white eyebrows were contracted to a single line on the umber parchment of his face, and beneath them his eyes were cold and green as the ice of ancient flows. His beard, half white, half of a black with glaucous gleams, fell nearly to his knees and hid many of the writhing serpentine characters inscribed in woven silver athwart the bosom of his violet robe. About him were scattered all of the appurtenances of his art, the skulls of men and monsters, phials filled with black or amber liquids whose sacrilegious use was known to none but himself, little drums of vulture skin and crotali made from the bones and teeth of the cocodril, used as an accompaniment to certain incantations. The mosaic floor was partly covered with the skins of enormous black and silver apes, and above the door there hung the head of a unicorn in which dwelt the familiar demon of Malygris in the form of a coral viper with pale green belly and ashen mottlings. Books were piled everywhere, ancient volumes bound in serpent skin, with verdigris in clasps, lost language, with verdigris in clasps that held the frightful lore of Atlantis, the pinnacles that have power upon the demons of the earth and the moon, the spells that transmute or disintegrate the elements, and runes from a lost language of Hyperborea, which, when uttered aloud, were more deadly than poison, or more potent than any philter. But though these things and the power they held or symbolized were the terror of the peoples and the envy of all rival magicians, the thoughts of Malygris were dark, with immitigable melancholy, and weariness filled his heart as ashes fill the hearth where a great fire has died. Immovable he sat, implacable he mused, while the sun of afternoon, declining on the city and on the sea that was beyond the city, smote with autumnal rays through the window of greenish-yellow glass, and touched his shrunken hands with its phantom gold, and fired the bale's rubies of his rings till they burned like demonian eyes. But in his musings there was neither light nor fire, and turning from the grayness of the present, from the darkness that seemed to close in so imminently upon the future, he groped among the shadows of memory, even as a blind man who has lost the sun and seeks it everywhere in vain. And all the vistas of time that had been so full of gold and splendor, the days of triumph that were colored like a soaring flame, the crimson and purple of the rich, imperial years of his prime, all these were chill and dim and strangely faded now, and the remembrance thereof was no more than the stirring of dead embers. Then Malygris groped backward to the years of his youth, to the misty, remote, incredible years where, like an alien star, one memory still burned with unfailing luster. The memory of the girl Nylissa, whom he had loved in days ere the lust of unpermitted knowledge and necromantic dominion had ever entered his soul. He had well nigh forgotten her for decades, in the myriad preoccupations of a life so bizarrely diversified, so replete with occult happenings and powers, with supernatural victories and perils. But now, at the mere thought of the slender and innocent child who had loved him so dearly when he too was young and slim and guileless, and who had died of a sudden mysterious fever on the very eve of their marriage day, the mummy-like umber of his cheeks took on a phantom flush, and deep down in the icy orbs was a sparkle like the gleam of mortuary tapers. In his dreams arose the irretrievable suns of youth, and he saw the myrtle-shaded valley of Meros and the stream Zamander, by whose ever-verdant merge he had walked at eventide with Nylissa, seeing the birth of summer stars in the heavens, the stream, and the eyes of his beloved. Now, addressing the demonian viper that dwelt in the head of the unicorn, Malygris spoke with the low, monotonous intonation of one who thinks aloud. Viper, in the years before you came to dwell with me and to make your abode in the head of the unicorn, I knew a girl who was lovely and frail as the orchids of the jungle, and who died as the orchids die. Viper, am I not Malygris, in whom is centered the mastery of all occult lore, all forbidden denominations, with dominion over the spirits of earth and sea and air, over the solar and lunar demons, over the living and the dead? If so I desire, can I not call the girl Nihilissa in the very semblance of all her youth and beauty, and bring her forth from the never-changing shadows of the cryptic tomb to stand before me in this chamber in the evening rays of this autumnal sun? Yes, master, replied the Viper in a low but singularly penetrating hiss. You are Malygris, and all sorceress or necromantic power is yours. All incantations and spells and pentacles are known to you. It is possible, if you so desire, to summon the girl Nihilissa from her abode among the dead, and to behold her again, as she was ere her loveliness had known the ravening kiss of the worm. Viper, is it well, is it meet that I should summon her thus? Will there be nothing to lose, and nothing to regret? The Viper seemed to hesitate. Then, in a more slow and measured hiss, it is meet for Malygris to do as he would. Who, save Malygris, can decide if a thing be well or ill? In other words, you will not advise me? The query was as much a statement as a question, and the Viper vouchsafed no further utterance. Malygris brooded for a while, with his chin on his knotted hands. Then he arose with a long, unwonted celerity and sureness of movement that belied his wrinkles, and gathered together, from different coins of the chamber, from ebony shelves, from caskets with locks of gold or brass or electrum, the sundry appurtenances that were needful for his magic. He drew on the floor the requisite circles, and standing within the centermost, he lit the thuribles that contained the prescribed incense, and read aloud from a long, narrow scroll of gray vellum the purple and vermilion runes of the ritual that summons the departed. The fumes of the censers, blue and white and violet, arose in thick clouds and speedily filled the room with ever-writhing, interchanging columns, among which the sunlight disappeared and was succeeded by a wan, unearthly glow, pale as the light of moons that ascend from Leth. With preternatural slowness, with unhuman solemnity, the voice of the necromancer went on in a priest-like chant till the scroll was ended and the last echoes lessened and died out in hollow, sepulchral vibrations. Then the colored vapors cleared away as if the folds of a curtain had been drawn back. But the pale, unearthly glow still filled the chamber, and between Malygris and the door where hung the unicorn's head there stood the apparition of Nihilissa, even as she had stood in the perished years, bending a little like a wind-blown flower, and smiling with the unmindful poignancy of youth. Fragile, pallid, and simply gowned, with anemone blossoms in her black hair, with eyes that held the newborn azure of vernal heavens, she was all that Malygris had remembered, and his sluggish heart was quickened with an old, delightful fever as he looked upon her. "Are you Nihilissa?" he asked. "The Nihilissa whom I loved in the myrtle-shaded valley of Meros, in the golden-hearted days that have gone with all dead aeons to the timeless gulf?" "Yes, I am Nihilissa." Her voice was the simple and rippling silver of the voice that had echoed so long in his memory, but somehow, as he gazed and listened, there grew a tiny doubt. A doubt no less absurd than intolerable, but nevertheless insistent. Was this altogether the same Nihilissa he had known? Was there not some elusive change, too subtle to be named or defined? Had time and the grave not taken something away? An innominable something that his magic had not wholly restored? Were the eyes as tender? Was the black hair as lustrous? The form as slim and supple as those of the girl he recalled? He could not be sure, and the growing doubt was succeeded by a leaden dismay, by a grim despondency that choked his heart as with ashes. His scrutiny became searching and exigent and cruel, and momently the phantom was less and less the perfect semblance of Nihilissa. Momently the lips and brow were less lovely, less subtle in their curves. The slender figure became thin, the tresses took on a common black, and the neck an ordinary pallor. The soul of Malygris grew sick again with age and despair and the death of his evanescent hope. He could believe no longer in love or youth or beauty, and even the memory of these things was as dubitable a mirage was a dubitable mirage, a thing that might or might not have been. There was nothing left but shadow and grayness and dust, nothing but the empty dark and the cold and a clutching weight of insufferable weariness, of immedicable anguish. In accents that were thin and quavering, like the ghost of his former voice, he pronounced the incantation that serves to dismiss a summoned phantom. The form of Nihilissa melted upon the air like smoke, and the lunar gleam that had surrounded her was replaced by the last rays of the sun. Malygris turned to the Viper and spoke in a tone of melancholy reproof. "Why did you not warn me?" "Would the warning have availed?" was the counter-question. "All knowledge was yours, Malygris, excepting this one thing, and in no other way could you have learned it." "What thing?" queried the magician. "I have learned nothing except the vanity of wisdom, the impotence of magic, the nullity of love, and the delusiveness of memory. Tell me, why could I not recall to life the same Nihilissa whom I knew, or thought I knew?" "It was indeed Nihilissa whom you summoned and saw," replied the Viper. "Your necromancy was potent up to this point, but no necromantic spell could recall for you your own lost youth, or the fervent and guileless heart that loved Nihilissa, or the ardent eyes that beheld her then. This, my master, was the thing that you had to learn." All right, cool. So what I was thinking of adding to my streams were maybe when I cross over particularly challenging words or unusual words, perhaps we'll go over them. And I might do so now before I take a break and start the next story. Now let's see. Fulvis. If I remember correctly, Fulvis was about something that is sort of like an orangey yellow. Let's double check though. Here we go. Fulvis, reddish yellow or tawny. There was another one about his beard as well. Glaucus, which refers to streaks of bluish black. But we'll double check to make sure I got the one right as well. Glaucus, of a dull grayish green or blue color. There you go. Anything else? Well, if I think of anything, I'll come back to it. All right, I'm going to take a brief break and drink some beer, and then we'll get started on the Death of Malygris. It's writers like Clark Ashton Smith and their various names and interesting nouns and adjectives that remind me it's probably a pretty good practice to to give the story an out loud dry run before I actually read it, so that I don't end up getting hung up on Poseidonis. Anyway, I'll be back in a minute. Alright, let's get started on story 2. So, I'm gonna allow the album to run for this one. We'll see if I can time it just right. There's a particular segment pertinent to the story, and if I can land it on or by the dialogue that it repeats, that would just be great. That would make me real happy. Anyway, here we go. This is my, I prefer this one of the two stories. The Death of Malygris by Clark Ashton Smith. At the hour of interlunar midnight, when lamps burned rarely and far apart in Susrin, and slow-moving autumn clouds had muffled the stars, King Gadaron sent forth into the sleeping city 12 of his trustiest mutes. Like shadows gliding through oblivion, they vanished upon their various ways, and each of them, returning presently to the darkened palace, led with them a shrouded figure no less discreet and silent than himself. In this manner, groping along tortuous alleys, through blind cypress caverns in the royal gardens, and down subterranean halls and steps, 12 of the most powerful sorcerers of Susrin were brought together in a vault of oozing, death-gray granite, far beneath the foundations of the palace. The entrance of the vault was guarded by earth demons that obeyed the arch-sorcerer Maranapian, who had long been the king's counselor. These demons would have torn limb from limb any who came unprepared to offer them a libation of fresh blood. The vault was lit dubiously by a single lamp, hollowed from a monstrous garnet and fed with viper's oil. Here, Gadarian, who came... pardon, I just totally missed that line. Here, Gadarian, crownless and wearing sackcloth dyed in sober purple, awaited the wizards on a seat of limestone wrought in the form of a sarcophagus. Maranapian stood at his right hand, immobile and swathed to the mouth in the garments of the tomb. Before him was a tripod of aurichalcum, rearing shoulder high, and on the tripod, in a silver socket, there reposed the enormous blue eye of a slain cyclops, wherein the archimage was said to behold weird visions. On this eye, gleaming balefully under the garnet lamp, the gaze of Maranapian was fixed with death-like rigidity. From these circumstances, the 12 sorcerers knew that the king had convened them only because of a matter supremely grave and secret. The hour and fashion of their summoning, the place of meeting, the terrible elemental guards, the mufti worn by Gadaron, all were proof of a need for preternatural stealth and privity. For a while, there was silence in the vault, and the 12, bowing deferentially, waited the will of Gadarian. Then, in a voice that was little more than a harsh whisper, the king spoke. "What know ye of Malygris?" Hearing that awful name, the sorcerers paled and trembled visibly, but one by one, as if speaking by rote, several of the foremost made answer to Gadarian's question. "Malygris dwells in his black tower above Susrin," said the first. "The night of his power is still heavy upon Poseidonis, and we others, moving in that night, are as shadows of a withered moon. He is overlord of all kings and sorcerers, yea, even the triremes that fare to Tartassos, and the far-flown eagles of the sea pass not beyond the black falling of his shadow. The demons of the 5 elements are his familiars," said the second. "The gross eyes of common men have beheld them often, flying like birds about his tower, or crawling lizard-wise on the walls and pavements." "Malygris sits in his high hall," avowed the third. "Unto him tribute is borne at the full moon from all the cities of Poseidonis. He takes a tithe of the lading of every galley. He claims a share of the silver and incense, of the gold and ivory sacred to the temples. His wealth is beyond the opulence of the sunken kings of Atlantis, even those kings who were thy forefathers, O Gadarian." "Malygris is as old as the moon," mumbled a fourth. He will live forever, armed against death with the dark magic of the moon. Death has become a slave in his citadel, toiling among other slaves and striking only at the foes of Malygris. Much of this was true formerly, quoth the king, with a sinister hissing of his breath. But now a certain doubt has arisen, for it may be that Malygris is dead. A communicated shiver seemed to run about the assembly. "Nay," said the sorcerer who had affirmed the immortality of Malygris, "for how can this thing have come to pass? The doors of his tower stood open today at sunset, and the priests of the ocean god, bearing a gift of pearls and purple dyes, went in before Malygris and found him sitting in his tall chair of the ivory of mastodons. He received them haughtily, without speaking, as is his wont, and his servants, who are half ape and half man, came in unbidden to carry away the tribute." "This very night," said another, "I saw the steadfast lamps of the sable tower, burning above the city like the eyes of Tyran, god of evil. The familiars have departed not from the tower as such beings depart at the dying of a wizard, for in that case men would have heard their howling and lamentation in the dark." "Aye," declared Gedairen, "men have been befooled ere this, and Malygris was ever the master of eluding shadows, of feints and beguilements. But there is one among us who discerns the truth. Marinapion, through the eye of the Cyclops, has looked on remote things and hidden places. Even now he peers upon his ancient enemy, Malygris." Marinapion, shuddering a little beneath his shroud-like garments, seemed to return from his clairvoyant absorption. He raised from the tripod his eyes of luminous amber, whose pupils were black and impenetrable as jet. "I have seen Malygris," he said, turning to the conclave. "Many times I have watched him thus, thinking to learn some secret of his close-hidden magic. I have spied upon him at noon, at evenfall, and through the drear, lampless vigils of midnight. And I have beheld him in the ashen dawn and the dawn of quickening fire. But always he sits in the great ivory chair, in the high hall of his tower, frowning as with meditation. And his hands clutch always the basilisk-carven arms of the chair, and his eyes turn evermore, unshutting, unblinking, toward the orient window and the heavens beyond, where only high-risen stars and clouds go by. Thus I have beheld him for the space of a whole year and a month, and each day I have seen his monsters bring before him vessels filled with rare meat and drink, and later they have taken away the vessels untouched. And never have I discerned the least movement of his lips, nor any turning or tremor of his body. For these reasons I deem that Malygris is dead, but by virtue of his supremacy in evil and in art magical, he sits defying the worm, still undecayed and incorrupt. And his monsters and his familiars attend him still, deceived by the lying appearance of life, and his power, though now an empty fraud, is still dark and awful upon Poseidonis." Again, following the slow, measured words of Marinapion, there was silence in the vault. A dark, furtive triumph smoldered in the face of Gedairen, on whom the yoke of Malygris had lain heavily, irking his pride. Among the 12 sorcerers there was none who wished well to Malygris, nor any who did not fear him, and they received the annunciation of his demise with dreadful, half-incredulous joy. Some there were who doubted, holding that Marinapion was mistaken, and in the faces of all, as in somber mirrors, their awe of the master was still reflected. Marinapion, who had hated Malygris above all others, as the one warlock whose art and power excelled his own, stood aloof and inscrutable, like a poising vulture. It was King Gediren who broke the gravid silence. Not idly have I called ye to this crypt, O sorcerers of Susrin, for a work remains to be done. Verily shall the corpse of a dead necromancer tyrannize over us all? There is a mystery here, and a need to move cautiously, for the duration of his necromancy is yet unverified and untested. But I have called ye together in order that the hardiest among ye may take counsel with Maranapian, and aid him in devising such wizardry as will now expose the fraud of Malygris, and evince his mortality to all men, as well as to the fiends that follow him still, and the ministering monsters. A babble of disputation rose, and they who were most doubtful of this matter, and feared to work against Malygris in any fashion, begged Gediren's leave to withdraw. In the end, there remained 7 of the 12. Swiftly, by dim and covert channels, on the day that followed, the death of Malygris was bruited throughout the isle, Poseidonis. Many disbelieved the story, for the might of the wizard was a thing seared as with hot iron on the souls of them that had witnessed his thaumaturgies. However, it was recalled that during the past few years, only a few had beheld him face to face, and always he had seemed to ignore them, speaking not, and staring fixedly through the tower window, as if intent on far things that were veiled to others. During that time, he had called no man to his presence, and had sent forth no message, no oracle or decree, and they who had gone before him were mainly bearers of tribute, and had followed a long-established custom. When these matters had become generally known, there were some who maintained that he sat thus, in a long swoon of ecstasy or catalepsy, and would awaken therefrom in time. Others, however, held that he had died, and was able to preserve the deceitful aspect of life through a spell that endured after him. No man dared to enter the tall, sable tower, and still the shadow of the tower fell athwart Susrin like the shadow of an evil gnomon moving on some disastrous dial. And still the umbrage of the power of Malygris lay stagnant as the tomb's night on the minds of men. Now, among the 5 sorcerers who had begged Gediren's leave to depart, fearing to join their fellows in the making of wizardry against Malygris, there were 2 that plucked heart a little afterward, when they heard from other sources a confirmation of the vision beheld by Maranapian through the Cyclops' eye. These 2 were brothers named Nigon and Fustules. Feeling a certain shame for their timidity and desiring to rehabilitate themselves in the regard of the others, they conceived an audacious plan. When night had again fallen upon the city, bringing no moon, but only obscure stars and the scud of sea-borne clouds, Nigon and Fustules went forth through the darkened ways, and came to the steep hill at the heart of Susrin, whereon, in half-immemorial years, Malygris had established his grim citadel. The hill was wooded with close-grown cypresses, whose foliage, even to the full sun, was black and somber, as if tarnished by wizard fumes. Crouching on either hand, they leaned like misshapen spirits of the night above the stairs of adamant that gave access to the tower. Nigon and Fustules, mounting the stairs, cowered and trembled when the bows swung menacingly toward them in violent gusts of wind. They felt the dripping of heavy sea dews blown in their faces like a spittle of demons. The wood, it seemed, was full of execrably sighing voices, and the weird whimpers and little moanings as of imp children astray from satanic dams. The lights of the tower burned through the waving boughs and seemed to recede unapproachably as they climbed. More than once the 2 regretted their temerity, but at length, without suffering palpable harm or hindrance, they neared the portals, which stood eternally open, pouring the effulgence of still, unflaring lamps on the windy darkness. Though the plan they had conceived was nefarious, they deemed it best to enter boldly. The purpose of their visit, if any should challenge or interrogate them, was the asking of an oracle from Malygris, who was famed throughout the isle as the most infallible of soothsayers. Freshening momentarily from the sea beyond Susrin, the wind clamored about the tower like an army of devils in flight from deep to deep, and the long mantles of the sorcerers were blown in their faces. But, entering the wide portals, they heard no longer the crying of the gale, and felt no more its pursuing rudeness. At a single step, they passed into the mausoleum of silence. Around them, the lamplight fell unshaken on caryatids of black marble, on mosaics of precious gems, on fabulous metals and many storied tapestries, and a tideless perfume weighed upon the air like a balsam of death. They felt an involuntary awe, deeming the mortal stillness a thing that was hardly natural. But seeing that the tower vestibule was unguarded by any of the creatures of Malygris, they were emboldened to go on and climb the Marmorian stairs to the apartments above. I'm going to wind up having to repeat this particular song. Everywhere, by the light of opulent lamps, they beheld inestimable and miraculous treasures. Inestimable, even, and miraculous treasures. There were tables of ebony wrought with sorcerous runes of pearl and white coral, webs of silver and samite cunningly pictured, caskets of electrum overflowing with talismanic jewels, tiny gods of jade and agate, and tall chryselephantine demons. Here was the loot of ages, lying heaped and mingled in utter negligence, without lock or ward, as if free for any casual thief. Eyeing the riches about them with covetous wonder, the two sorcerers mounted slowly from room to room, unchallenged and unmolested, and came ultimately to that upper hall in which Malygris was wont to receive his visitors. Here, as elsewhere, the portal stood open before them and lamps burned as if in a trance of light. The lust of plunder was hot in their hearts, made bolder still by the seeming desolation, and thinking now that the tower was uninhabited by any but the dead magician, they went in with little hesitancy. I'm gonna have to restart that. Like the rooms below, the chamber was full of precious artifacts, and iron-bound volumes, and brazen books of occult, tremendous necromancy, together with golden and earthen censers and vials of unshatterable crystal, were strewn in weird confusion about the mosaic floor. At the very center there sat the old Arcane in his chair of primeval ivory, peering with stark, immovable eyes at that night-black window. Nigon and Fustules felt their awe return upon them, remembering too clearly now the thrice baleful mastery that this man had wielded, and the demon lore he had known, and the spells he had wrought that were irrefragable by other wizards. The specters of these things rose up before them as if by a final necromancy. With down-dropped eyes and humble mien, they went forward, bowing reverentially. Then, speaking aloud, in accordance with their predetermined plan, Fustules requested an oracle of their fortunes from Malygris. There was no answer, and lifting their eyes, the brothers were greatly reassured by the aspect of the seated ancient. Death alone could have set the grayish pallor on the brow, could have locked the lips in a rigor as of fast-frozen clay. The eyes were like cavern-shadowed ice, holding no other light than a vague reflection of the lamps. Under the beard that was half silver, half sable, the cheeks had already fallen in as with beginning decay, showing the harsh outlines of the skull. The gray and hideously shrunken hands, whereupon the eyes of enchanted beryls and rubies burned, were clenched inflexibly on the chair arms, which had the form of arcing basilisks. "Verily," murmured Nigon, "there is naught here to frighten or dismay us. Behold, it is only the lich of an old man, after all, and one that has cheated the worm of his due provender overlong." "Aye," said Fustules, "but this man, in his time, was the greatest of all necromancers. Even the ring on his little finger is a sovereign talisman. The ballast ruby of the thumb ring of his right hand will conjure demons from out of the deep. In the volumes that lie about the chamber, there are secrets of perished gods and the mysteries of planets immemorial. In the vials, there are syrups that give strange visions and philters that can revive the dead. Among these things, it is ours to choose freely." Nigon, eyeing the gems greedily, selected a ring that encircled the right forefinger with the sixfold coils of a serpent of Aricalcom, bearing in its mouth a barrel shaped like a griffin's egg. Vainly, however, he tried to loosen the finger from its rigid clutch on the chair arm to permit the removal of the ring. Muttering impatiently, he drew a knife from his girdle and prepared to hew away the finger. In the meanwhile, Fustules had drawn his own knife as a preliminary before approaching the other hand. "Is thy heart firm within thee, brother?" he inquired in a sort of sibilant whisper. "If so, there is even more to be gained than these talismanic rings. It is well known that a wizard who attains to such supremacy as Malygris undergoes by virtue thereof a complete bodily transformation, turning his flesh into elements more subtle than those of common flesh. And whoso eats of his flesh, even so much as a tiny morsel, will share thereafter in the powers owned by the wizard." Nigon nodded as he bent above the chosen finger. "This too was in my thoughts," he answered. Before he or Fustules could begin their ghoulish attack, they were startled by a venomous hissing that appeared to emanate from the bosom of Malygris. They drew back in amazement and consternation, while a small coral viper slid from behind the necromancer's beard and glided swiftly over his knees to the floor like a sinuous rill of scarlet. There, coiling as if to strike, it regarded the thieves with eyes that were cold and malignant as drops of frozen poison. "By the black thorns of Taran!" cried Fustules. "It is one of Malygris's familiars. I have heard of this viper." Turning, the two would have fled from the room, but even as they turned, the walls and portals seemed to recede before them, fleeing giddily and interminably as if unknown gulfs had been admitted to the chamber. A vertigo seized them. Reeling, they saw the little segments of mosaic under their feet assume the proportions of mighty flags. Around them, the strewn books and censers and vials loomed enormous, rearing above their heads and barring their way as they ran. Nigon, looking over his shoulder, saw that the viper had turned to a vast python whose crimson coils were undulating swiftly along the floor. In a colossal chair, beneath lamps that were large as suns, there sat the colossal form of the dead Archimage, in whose presence Nigon and Fustules were no more than pygmies. The lips of Malygris were still immobile beneath his beard, and his eyes glared implacably upon the blackness of the far window. But at that instant, a voice filled the awful spaces of the room, reverberating like thunder in the heavens, hollow and tremendous. "Fools, ye have dared to ask me for an oracle, and the oracle is death." Nigon and Fustules, knowing their doom, fled on in a madness of terror and desperation. Beyond the towering thuribles, the tomes that were piled like pyramids, they saw the threshold in intermittent glimpses like a remote horizon. It withdrew before them, dim and unattainable. They panted as runners pant in a dream. Behind them, the vermilion python crawled, and overtaking them as they tried to round the brazen back of a wizard volume, it struck them down like fleeing dormice. In the end, there was only a small coral viper that crept back to its hiding place in the bosom of Malygris. Toiling by day and night in the vaults under the place of Godiren, with impious charms and unholy conjurations and fouler chemistries, Marinapian and his 7 coadjutors had nearly completed the making of their sorcery. Oh, hang on. We have Malygris coming to us direct from Aracanist. Anyway, toiling by day and night in the vaults under the palace of Godiren, with impious charms and unholy conjurations and fouler chemistries, Marinapian and his 7 coadjutors had nearly completed the making of their sorcery. They designed an infiltration against Malygris that would break the power of the dead necromancer by rendering evident to all the mere fact of his death. Employing an unlawful Atlantean science, Marinapian had created living plasm with all the attributes of human flesh, and had caused it to grow and flourish, fed with blood. Then he and his assistants, uniting their wills and convoking the forces that were blasphemy to summon, had compelled the shapeless, palpitating mass to put forth the limbs and members of a newborn child, and had formed it, ultimately, after all the changes that man would undergo between birth and senescence, into an image of Malygris. Now, carrying the process even further, they caused the simulacrum to die of extreme age, as Malygris had apparently died. It sat before them in a chair, facing toward the east, and duplicating the very posture of the magician on his seat of ivory. Nothing remained to be done. For spent and weary, but hopeful, the sorcerers waited for the first signs of mortal decay in the image. If the spells they had woven were successful, a simultaneous decay would occur in the body of Malygris, incorruptible heretofore. Inch by inch, member by member, he would rot in the adamantine tower. His familiars would desert him, no longer deceived, and all who came to the tower would know his mortality, and the tyranny of Malygris would lift from Susrin, and his necromancy be null and void as a broken pentacle in sea-girt Poseidonis. For the first time since the beginning of their infiltration, the 8 magicians were free to intermit their vigilance without peril of invalidating the charm. They slept soundly, feeling that their repose was well earned. On the morrow they returned, accompanied by King Gediren, to the vault in which they had left the plasmic image. Opening the sealed door, they were met by a charnel odor, and were gratified to perceive in the figure the unmistakable signs of decomposition. A little later, by consulting the Cyclops' eye, Marinapian verified the paralleling of these marks in the features of Malygris. A great jubilation, not unmingled with relief, was felt by the sorcerers and by King Gediren. Heretofore, not knowing the extent and duration of the powers wielded by the dead master, they had been doubtful of the efficacy of their own magic. But now, it seemed, there was no longer any reason for doubt. On that very day, it happened that certain seafaring merchants went before Malygris to pay him, according to custom, a share of the profits of their latest voyage. Even as they bowed in the presence of the master, they became aware, by sundry disagreeable tokens, that they had borne tribute to a corpse. Not daring even then to refuse the long exacted toll, they flung it down and fled from the place in terror. Soon, in all Susrin, there was none who doubted any longer the death of Malygris, and yet such was the awe he had wrought through many lustrums that few were venturous enough to invade the tower, and thieves were wary and would not try to despoil its fabled treasures. Day by day, in the blue, monstrous eye of the Cyclops, Marinapian saw the rotting of his dreaded rival, and upon him presently there came a strong desire to visit the tower and behold face to face that which he had witnessed only in vision. Thus alone would his triumph be complete. So it was that he and the sorcerers who had aided him, together with King Gediren, went up to the sable tower by the steps of adamant, and climbed by the marble stairs, even as Nigon and Fustules before them, to the high room in which Malygris was seated. But the doom of Nigon and Fustules, being without other witnesses than the dead, was wholly unknown to them. Boldly and with no hesitation they entered the chamber. Slanting through the western window, the sun of late afternoon fell goldenly on the dust that had gathered everywhere. Spiders had woven their webs on the bright jeweled censers, on the graven lamps, and the metal-covered volumes of sorcery. The air was stagnant with a stifling foulness of death. The intruders went forward, feeling that impulse which leads the victors to exult over a vanquished enemy. Malygris sat unbowed and upright, his black and tattered fingers clutching the ivory chair arms as of yore, and his empty orbits glowering still at the eastern window. His face was little more than a bearded skull, and his blackening brow was like worm-pierced ebony. "O Malygris, I give thee greeting," said Maranapian in a loud voice of mockery. "Grant, I beseech thee, a sign, if thy wizardry still prevails and hath not become the appanage of oblivion." "Greeting, O Maranapian," replied a grave and terrible voice that issued from the maggot-eaten lips. "Indeed, I will grant thee a sign, even as I in death have rotted upon my seat from the foul sorcery which was wrought in the vaults of King Gadiren, so thou and thy fellows and Gadiren living shall decay and putrefy wholly in an hour by virtue of the curse that I put upon ye now." Then the shrunken corpse of Malygris, fulminating the runes of an old Atlantean formula, cursed the 8 sorcerers and King Gadiren. The formula, at frequent intervals, was cadenced with fatal names of lethal gods, and in it were told the secret appellations of the black god of time and the nothingness that abides beyond time, and use was made of the titles of many tomb-layering demons. Heavy and hollow-sounding were the runes, and in them one seemed to hear a noise of great blows on sepulchral doors and a clangor of down-fallen slabs. The air darkened as if with the hovering of a seasonless night, and thereupon, like a breathing of the night, a chillness entered the chamber, and it seemed that the black wings of ages passed over the tower, beating prodigiously from void to void, ere the curse was done. Hearing that Maranatha, the sorcerers were dumb with the extremity of their dread, and even Maranapian could recall no counterspell effectual in any degree against it. All would have fled from the room ere the curse ended, but a mortal weakness was upon them, and they felt a sickness as of quick-coming death. Shadows were woven athwart their eyes, but through the shadows each beheld dimly the instant blackening of the faces of his fellows, and saw the cheeks fall ruinously, and the lips curl back onto the teeth like those of long-dead cadavers. Trying to run, each was aware of his own limbs that rotted beneath him, piece by piece, and felt the quick sloughing of his flesh and corruption from the bone. Crying out with tongues that shriveled ere the cry was done, they fell down on the floor of the chamber. Life lingered in them, together with the dire knowledge of their doom, and they preserved something of hearing and sight. In the dark agony of their live corruption, they tossed feebly to and fro and crawled inchmeal on the chill mosaic. And they still moved in this fashion, slowly and more imperceptibly, till their brains were turned to gray mold, and the sinews were parted from their bones, and the marrow was dried up. Thus, in an hour, the curse was accomplished. The enemies of the necromancer lay before him, supine and shrunken, in the tomb's final posture, as if doing obeisance to a seated death. Except for the garments, none could have told King Gadiren from Naramapian, nor Maranapian from the lesser wizards. The day went by, declining seaward, and, burning like a royal pyre behind Susrin, the sunset flung an aureate glare through the window, and then dropped away in red brands and funeral ashes. And in the twilight, a coral viper glided from the bosom of Malygris, and weaving among the remnants of them that lay on the floor, and slipping silently down the stairs of marble, it passed forever from the tower. All right, that was my Clark Ashton Smith Malygris double feature. I don't know, man. Clark Ashton Smith just gets me feeling real dramatic. I will add that his florid prose, as interesting and engaging as it is, and as much as it paints a very vivid picture, can be very challenging to read quickly and on the fly to music. So I appreciate everyone who listened in for bearing with me during this process, because there were definitely some stumbling blocks, but I had a good time. I don't care how corny it might have sounded. It was fun for me. So, if you tuned in, I really appreciate it. I'd like to give another shout out to Aracanist for letting me play their album Poseidonis during this, and also to Yuggoth Records for allowing me to do so as well. I really can't stress that I've I've been listening to that album on repeat for days. The same way I often listen to Eindalmadir on repeat for reading and writing. I just love it. It's so good. It's so atmospheric. It's got that Berlin School that kind of calls out to Tangerine Dream or Vangelis or whatever, that feeling. Yeah, take a look on Bandcamp. I've got both the record label and the Bandcamp for the album listed in my About section, so please pop by and take a look. Yeah, and in the meantime, head over to YouTube where I've got the Rialto stories uploading in case you're behind on those. You can listen in and catch up. And yeah, I don't know, I'll probably get back to Rialto on Wednesday night. That's going to be a goal for me, so listen in if you feel like it. And yeah, thanks for hanging out. Take it easy. Oh, wait, some words. Well, I didn't really take notes ahead of time, so going through vocab right now might just kind of be a chore. But here's an interesting one. Clark Ashton Smith, instead of Archmage, uses the much more archaic Archimage. It's literally Arch-image as one word. It's, to me, a very interesting alternative to Archmage. So in case you were confused about that, that's what that is. But yeah, thanks for hanging, and I'll see you next time, folks. Take it easy.